Hey everyone. So I came across a clip of Senator Rand Paul speaking to Secretary of State Marco Rubio in a Senate hearing the other day, and I want to react to it. Now, Rand Paul has been one of the most vocal critics of American action against Iran. I've talked about some of his arguments before. It's been a while since I've talked about him. He's a libertarian, he's consistent, he's a smart guy, and he raises some legitimate points. But he also makes some arguments that I think are just wrong, and they're wrong in ways that are common. They kind of reveal a fundamental flaw in how a lot of Westerners think. So what he says just rings true to a lot of people, and it feels like common sense, but it's wrong. And that's what I'm going to be pointing out in this video. So let's go ahead and watch the clip. This is, again, Senator Rand Paul speaking to Marco Rubio. Here we go.
I am glad to hear today, though, that the administration and the negotiations are willing to trade sanctions relief for removal of enriched uranium. I've said for a long time and argued for a long time that sanctions in and of themselves rarely, if ever, are of any value. I've yet to see any Chinese behavior that's changed because of sanctions. I've yet to see any Russian behavior change because of sanctions. I've really yet to see any Iranian behavior change because of sanctions. However, sanctions do have some leverage and ability to exact change if you remove them. So the removal of sanctions might actually have some hope. So,
okay, this is the first place I have to push back, because he's defining the goal of sanctions incorrectly. He's saying that sanctions don't change behavior, and he's right. They often do not change behavior. They rarely do. But that was never the point. Nobody sat down and said, let's impose sanctions so that the Ayatollahs will change the way they behave. No one's naive enough to think that that's the way it works. The goal is to prevent bad behavior by making it financially impossible. Here's the proof. During President Trump's first term, when maximum pressure sanctions were in full effect, and they were different. The sanctions were different in the first term. Let me explain a major difference. In the second term, the sanctions officially make it illegal for Iran to sell its oil. The oil is sanctioned, but there's no penalty for a country that is found to be purchasing Iranian oil. But in the first term, no one could buy Iranian oil. If you bought Iranian oil, you couldn't do business with the US. And that basically meant that no one was buying their oil, including the Chinese, and they were going broke. They really were. Those have never been reinstated. Well, very recently, only now during the war, Scott Bessent announced that they're reinstating that type of sanctions. But during the first Trump term, when the maximum pressure sanctions were in full effect, and there's other elements to them, just suffice it to say, we've never returned to those maximum pressure sanctions. The Iranian regime was on the verge of collapse. Hamas and Hezbollah were severely underfunded. Now, but it wasn't only, we're talking about what sanctions do. Here's another example from Trump's first term. Trump signed into law the Taylor Force Act, which withheld funding from the Palestinian Authority so long as it continued to pay the families of terrorists. Now, Trump hasn't reinstated adherence to that. The Biden administration violated the Taylor Force Act, even though it's a law. But during Trump's first term, he enforced that. He actually withheld all the funding from the Palestinian Authority because of this. And guess what happened as a result of both of the sanctions on Iran, mainly those, but also essentially what was sanctions on the Palestinian Authority? Well, in the state of Israel, in the entire history of the state of Israel from 1948 till today, a lot of people don't realize this. I looked it up. I did the research. In the entire history of the state of Israel, from 1948 till today, the 3 calendar years that had the lowest number, the smallest number of casualties, of deaths from terrorism in Israel were: the third lowest ever was 2018, the second lowest ever was 2019, and the lowest ever was 2020, the last 3 years of the Trump administration after he instituted all these sanctions and signed the Taylor Force Act. This wasn't about changing their behavior. It wasn't about making the Palestinian Authority reform its ways or making the Iranians reform their ways. Hezbollah still wanted to kill Israelis. Hamas still wanted to kill Israelis, but they just were underfunded. They didn't have the money to pay the people. This is not about changing behavior. It's about preventing behavior. There's a difference. Now, Rand Paul also says here that sanctions relief, removing them, can be leverage in a negotiation. Fine, that's a fair point, but the pressure was already doing the work without any deal. Why would you trade away the thing that's actually working for a piece of paper with a regime whose word means nothing? More on that in a few moments. Okay, let's go back to the clip.
But I support the administration in this. Now, there are many Republican critics who have been vocal on the airways recently saying, oh, no, we can never negotiate with them. These are terrible people. Well, you don't really negotiate with really friendly, good people. In a time of war, you're going to have to negotiate with an adversary. So I do commend and supportive of the idea of this. And the other thing is it's very verifiable. You don't even have to wait for verification. You could say the trade sanctions end as soon as we get the 440 kilograms of enriched uranium. Now, it has to be dug, I guess, some of it from under a mountain of rubble, but at the same time, be very verifiable. But what I would argue and what I would advise is that you really, why not offer everything? Offer all of the relief of virtually all of the sanctions if you get it. Now, you can wait if that's what you want, is the enriched uranium out and a promise. Now, the rabid hawks will argue, well, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. We're not going to negotiate with bad people. Then they'll continue to have enriched uranium, and they'll continue to enrich uranium.
Okay. This is what we call a straw man argument. Rand Paul here says, you know what a straw man argument is, where you claim that the person you're disagreeing with or debating is making a certain claim that they're not actually making, and then you push back against that, but it's not actually what they claim. What he says here is that critics of negotiations are arguing that these are terrible people, so you can't talk to them. We don't negotiate with terrorists. We don't negotiate with bad people. And of course, and he said, well, of course you don't negotiate with bad people. Like, of course you have to negotiate with your adversaries, right? But that's not the argument. Nobody serious is saying that Iran is too evil to negotiate with, and that's why we shouldn't negotiate with them because they're bad. The argument is that negotiations with this particular regime are futile, are structurally futile. That their word is meaningless, not as a moral judgment because they're evil, but because as a strategic fact. We know this because Iran's own officials have publicly said that they negotiate only to show the world that they're not avoiding talks. That's not my characterization. That's a member of Iran's Parliamentary National Security Committee saying it out loud. The Iranians, they have a different concept of negotiation. More importantly, this is the key point. The regime's survival depends on continued hostility towards the West and Israel. It's not a sidebar to who they are. It's not just a piece of their foreign policy. It's the foundation of their whole regime. Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed on February 28th, said it over and over again. His line was, death to America and death to Israel are not a slogan, they are a policy. It's the foundation of who they are. A regime that would make peace with America and Israel would not be the Islamic Republic of Iran. So when you negotiate with them and they agree to something and then immediately disregard it and start reconstituting themselves, that's what happens with Hezbollah. It's the same ideology. Every time there's a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and we've been dealing with them for over 40 years, every time there's a ceasefire with Hezbollah, they violate it immediately. Agreements mean nothing to these people because of their religion and their ideology. It's not because they're evil. Look what happened after the 12-day war. They immediately doubled down, ramped up their ballistic missile production, invested all the billions of dollars they were making from some sanctions relief that Trump gave them. They invested all of it in ramping up their military capabilities, even though it meant that their people were starving. That's who they are. Negotiations are meaningless with them. That's why we don't. The opponents of negotiations aren't saying it because we don't, on principle, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. They're bad people. No, that's a straw man argument. It's a structural problem. Negotiating with them doesn't resolve anything. It just extends and legitimizes the regime. All right. Let's go a little further with Rand Paul here.
So I do think that the argument that there hasn't been a military solution to this is largely proven by the fact that even though we've militarily obliterated their military, all of that is true. It's as Fred Ickley wrote in Every War Must End, that military victory doesn't always translate or lead to political resolution or to things that you want done. You know, what we really want done is no more enriched uranium, and you don't enrich uranium, you give up on these hopes. But I would say that as we are looking at trading sanctions, you say there's some you can do on your own, there's some that are congressional. I would be bringing in the leaders in the Congress who can give up on these sanctions and hopefully try to get their voice saying yes, if they will give up. Because if you give up like, a few piddling ones that that won't change things, that the White House has the ability to do, and you still have all these congressional sanctions. If you're on the other side of that equation, you might say, we're not giving up the one thing we think is leverage, the enriched uranium, for maybe a little bit of sanctions relief. So I would say really go all in on it, because it would be verifiable. You don't have to wait and prove it. You would have to prove in the future whether they're enriching. But I think that is a good step forward. But it's also important for people to have a discussion of what diplomacy is, and that diplomacy doesn't always have a bad name. And frankly, I'm glad to hear that the administration is negotiating, and I wish you luck. And I'd love to hear your response in general.
Well, first of all, the president's made clear the priority is Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. And what do they need to have a nuclear weapon? They need a couple things. They need the ability to enrich, that has been substantially destroyed, but could always be rebuilt over time. And the second is the ability, and highly enriched uranium, that's 60%, that could quickly be enriched to 90% weapons grade. The second point you make is about sanctions. So that's the goal here. And the sanctions, first of all, there's a combination of sanctions. There's sanctions that block direct sort of activities that generate revenue. And that's problematic beyond the nuclear program, because they also use this revenue to fund sponsors, to sponsor terrorism like Hezbollah and others around the region. And then there's the frozen assets, which are related to sanctions, but these are Iranian assets that have been frozen that they don't have access to. So what I would argue, and again, I don't want to get ahead of myself because we're not engaged in this conversation with them yet, but if you get into a situation in which the reason why there are sanctions are because the nuclear program, and so if they comply with what we're demanding on the nuclear side of it, zero enrichment, get rid of the enriched uranium, they're complying with these things, then I think that's the place where the frozen assets could be discussed.
Look at the difference. He's talking about compliance, and Rand Paul was talking about getting an agreement. Rand Paul actually believes that something that the Iranian regime would agree to, that has some actual value. Like, that's what he thinks here.
The more they give, the more they would get. I think ultimately we will still face other challenges related to Iran separate from the nuclear program, like what they use their money on, which is to sponsor Hezbollah and to sponsor Hamas and to sponsor terrorism around the world. But on the nuclear question, which was the president's been focused on now, no nuclear weapon program, the sanctions that are directly related to the nuclear program, the more they give, theoretically, the more they should be willing to get. What they're not going to get it is a down payment. They're not.
Right. The more they give, the more they get. It's not that they have to agree to something. It's that they have to comply. That's a huge difference. It's not about agreeing. It's about complying. And Rand Paul is saying, well, if you can get them to agree, then, lift the sanctions. Agreeing versus complying. Huge distinction.
Going to get as a signing bonus. And I would also point out that negotiations on nuclear matters are highly complex, highly technical. And so it will take some time to work through that, as is sanctions, by the way, highly technical, and in many cases multifaceted. There are UN sanctions, there are US sanctions, there are US congressional sanctions. So there's a lot to unravel there.
Is benefit from the idea of trading sanctions relief for activity. And if you don't ever trade them, if you just have them on the book, then I think they're of little value in changing behavior. Thank you.
He believes they're of little value in changing behavior. Well, like I said, they're not about changing behavior. Look, I understand the instinct behind what Rand Paul is saying. right? War is terrible. Diplomacy is reasonable. Nobody wants escalation. But I want to zoom out for a second because I think all of Rand Paul's mistakes here all are actually, they all have the same root cause. They're almost like the applications of the same mistake. So Rand Paul has been, as I said at the beginning, one of the loudest voices against American action against Iran, against this war. And one of his arguments has been that if America bombs Iran, he made this argument, I remember talking about it in a video a few months ago. He made an argument that if America bombs Iran, the Iranian people will rally around the regime. And that sounds logical, right? That's what happens in a lot of countries, but it's completely wrong about Iran. During the 12-day war, when Israel was striking Iranian targets, the Iranian people were cheering them on openly. One of Iran's most celebrated soccer legends at the time came out publicly in support of the Israeli strikes because the Iranian people hate the regime. They want it gone. There's no country in the world with a greater disconnect between its people and its rulers. And that same misunderstanding is behind everything we just heard in this clip from Rand Paul. When he says sanctions don't change behavior, he's imagining a normal government that responds to economic incentives the way a normal government would. When he says we need to negotiate with adversaries, he's imagining a regime that wants to survive in the conventional sense, and that when you negotiate with them and agree to something, it's an agreement. But here's what Rand Paul doesn't seem to understand about Shiite Islamic thinking. Compromise is not a virtue in their worldview. The concept of negotiation is viewed differently. Compromise and negotiation are signs of weakness for them. That is how they think. This is not an epithet. This is not an insult to them. It's a different culture. And, one of the big arrogant, it's a point of arrogance of Westerners that they assume that everyone else is functioning with the same incentives that they're functioning with. Everyone really everyone really wants the same things. And it's just not true. The idea that something agreed to and signed on a piece of paper, you shake hands, you sign something, that binds you in some way, which is an obvious concept. Of course, you put your name on a piece of paper, you signed it. Why does that bind you? That is actually, believe it or not, that's a Western concept. I mean, it exists in Jewish tradition as well. That's where, you have concept of documents and signing things. But in that part of the world, it has no real bearing on how states behave. I'm not saying they don't have any contract law among individuals, but at the state level, at the national level, it's irrelevant. There are literally no examples of signed agreements in this part of the world that were then adhered to as written. It just doesn't happen. The JCPOA wasn't even signed, and Iran was violating its terms almost immediately anyway. Like I said, every agreement with Hezbollah, like even the peace deal between Israel and Egypt that everyone looks at as a model because it's held up since 1979. It's not being implemented as written. It hasn't been since the beginning. So when Rand Paul imagines a negotiation where they can agree to something, let them agree, and then we'll lift sanctions. When he imagines a negotiation where Iran gives up enriched uranium and then honors the commitment, he's projecting a Western moral framework onto a regime that does not operate that way. So when Rubio, and he didn't say it explicitly, I stopped it and said it explicitly, Rubio's talking about compliance. If they comply, they can get rewarded. Because that's about actions. It's not about the negotiation. It's not about an agreement. It's not about someone's word. Their own officials openly say that they negotiate only to show the world they're not avoiding talks. It's not a leak. That is a public statement because that's how all Iranians think. That's their culture. And this regime's survival depends on permanent hostility toward the West and Israel. Look, Rand Paul's a smart guy. He's a principled man, but he is applying a libertarian Western framework to a regime that doesn't operate by any of those rules. And when it comes to Iran, that is a very dangerous mistake. All right, folks, keep watching, keep sharing. God bless. Thank you so much for helping grow the channel. And please tell others what we're doing here. And let's keep praying for a good outcome to all of this. because the story is far from over. God bless.